asking psychologists to weigh in. And so I saw a number of stories where psychologists would comment, some of whom didn't know a thing about comics. So they weren't engaged in, that's why I was over here going, no. Yeah. They really weren't engaged in comics scholarship. They're responding to questions and speculating. Well, it's like based on what we see in that '89 movie. Some would say he has these symptoms of PTSD, so they're speculating based on that. But really, no. Not until the 21st century. And we see an explosion of it in the 21st century. A 2004 book by Danny Fingeroth. His book Superman on the Couch, which I keep seeing people refer to as a psychology book about Superman. It's not. I understand it from the title. But Danny, a comic book writer, an editor, very important, and he's also a scholar, a friend to several of us. Wasn't back then, but Danny writes this book speculating about how we view comics and how they influence society. And he looked at some things within the story, and there was a point in there where he commented on page 23 about how there had been little written in recent decades by mental health professionals about superheroes. There is much literature about fairy tales and mythology, including works by, and he names all these things, but no major specific studies of superheroes by psychiatrists or psychologists. Now, Danny told me later that he braced himself for people to inundate him with, no, there's this and this and this, you are so wrong, Fingeroth. And not one person ever corrected him, because there wasn't anything. But things start changing in the 21st century for a lot of different reasons. We got superhero movies starting early in the 21st century. Comic book movies, put it more broadly. Blade, X-Men, Spider-Man. They show that people are ready for different kinds of comic book related movies, which, that movie, the abomination known as Batman, Ampersand, Robin, had really said, okay, what we're doing isn't working at all. New kinds of stories are being told with greater depth to character and just different kinds of stories. What else is going on in the 21st century? Why? And we can talk about the forms of it. What is involved and why? What's different about the 21st century?
Technology.
Okay. Psychology itself is different?
Well, I said technology.
Oh, I heard technology. Okay, psychology. What kind of technology makes a difference?
Well, we have CGI for the films that make them much more interesting. We have cell phones and the internet in particular, which gave everybody a voice. And then those are the big ones, but
I think
we only had 2 cups of coffee today.
We were sort of hitting this new era of comics where in the 80s there was a very deconstructionist attitude. Well, let's rip this down, and you have Watchmen that basically says, let's look at a world where no superheroes actually exist. We just have people who try to be superheroes, but they can't be because that's not realistic. And one of them also gets naked and godlike. And then you also have like Dark Knight Returns, where it's okay. Well, what if Batman retired for 10 years, and now when he comes back, he is crazy, and is sort of being just throwing away some of his principles, and is now much more brutal and more realistic in what a guy like Batman would be if he spent night after night facing this evil. You had this very deconstructionist thing, and that's spread out through comics where they were revising Origins with this new idea. Plastic Man, who was always a comedic character and meant to be sort of a cartoon even amongst the superheroes, was now explained as he had brain damage and so saw the world as a cartoon, that he was hallucinating, and that's why he's silly. It was very weird. And in the 90s we started going into a school of thought that wanted a renaissance of, let's just have fun, guys. And I think in the 21st century, we really started getting into like these sort of 2 schools of thought, where there's the one deconstructionist school of thought, and there's the one, let's just embrace Silver Age Renaissance and Golden Age Renaissance, and a lot of things that fall in between. And certainly with September 11th and other events, that pushed that even further, because now you have so many things where the first thing they say is, well, you have to look at Superman in a post-9/11 world. And that just immediately is informing how they want to approach the character before anything else, before any discussion about how realistic are his powers, where does the costume come from, how does his dad die, before anything else. Is just, well, in the post-9/11 world, how do we view a guy falling from the sky? Stuff like that.
In the last few decades, we've really seen comics just completely explode in terms of how much better they've been able to portray human nature, especially after they did away with Comics Code Authority. I don't know if you want to talk about that. So after Wertham's book, Seduction of Vincent, there was this code that was implemented for the comic books where they weren't allowed to portray certain things in comic books, like nudity or standing up against the government. The good guys always had to win. The police could never be portrayed as the bad guys.
No vampires, no witches, no devil worship.
No supernatural stuff at all.
If you have an affair, then one of the people has to die.
Yep.
Or go to jail.
So because of all of these rules and restrictions, you can imagine that the creativity and the extent to which these comic books were realistic was non-existent or rather poor. And then was it the early 80s that they started kind of venturing away from that, and then...
It was more in the 70s, where the 70s was also this interesting generation because for the first time you had comic book writers and artists who had grown up with comics, that had not been a thing before. And by growing up, I meant when you were really little, like below 10. This was the first generation that was really doing that, starting in the late 60s, really, and then exploding in the 70s. And it was also becoming apparent that we now had a different readership, because in the 40s and 50s, the general assumption was you read comics for about 3 years and then you dropped out. That was just the nature of things. And now, by the late 60s, you had people who would still be collecting after 10 years, or even 5 years was just like a long time to be considered. And they were keeping track of the continuity, and they were really seeing this as a saga unfolding. And you had people in college who really loved the Hulk and Spider-Man as counterculture symbols against authority, and all this jazz. So you started changing, and the code let down some rules.
I do need time to talk about the 21st century.
Right. Like the code let down some rules, and that's when we started getting stories about social justice, and Green Arrow's sidekick's now on drugs, and Superman's wondering his place in the world and responsibility, and so yeah, and then that went into the 80s and blah blah blah, what we talked about.
Okay.